What's up, everyone, and welcome back to the pod. Today we're diving into a topic that's been blowing up across think tanks, newsrooms, and Twitter warriors: the rumors of a potential US escalation in Venezuela.
Yeah, it started as whispers, then statements, then anonymous officials doing their thing. And now people are asking, is Washington actually preparing for something, or is it just geopolitical cosplay?
Venezuela isn't just a struggling state, it's a strategic hotspot where the US, Russia, China, and half the damn region are playing a messy power game.
So today we're unpacking all of it. Leave a thumbs up, a sub, and sit back and relax.
Alright, let's do this. So, what's been actually happening in the last weeks and months? Well, the US literally hit Venezuelan oil tankers involved in sanctioned shipments, calling them illicit assets funding authoritarian networks. That alone sent Maduro into a panic mode speeches on national TV.
Yeah, and Washington didn't stop there. They ramped up maritime enforcement in the Caribbean and hinted that further measures are coming. That's diplomatic code for don't test us. So what's pushing this sudden spike?
Well, Venezuela still has the world's biggest oil reserves. The US doesn't need the barrels, it needs to stop Russia and China from using them. And of course, it's useful for itself too. Right now, Caracas is basically a Moscow Beijing joint venture.
China refinances that. Russia provides advisors and security tech. When the US hits tankers, it's not just punishing Maduro, it's blocking their influence in America's own hemisphere.
Yeah. Then there's the migration angle too. Millions fleeing Venezuela, pressure on US border states, political backlash, especially in election season.
So the US frames escalation as regional stabilization, not intervention. But let's be real, the messaging is strategic, the motivation is domestic.
The recent elections were chaotic, irregularities, opposition suppression, you name it. Maduro tightened his grip, and Washington now uses that as a narrative tool. He said, "We're defending democracy."
But that's packaging. The real game is just geopolitical.
And what about a full invasion? Zero chance, too expensive, too messy. But limited actions already happening.
Yeah, the playbook includes naval pressure, sanctions with teeth, cyber ops, targeting illicit flows, support for opposition networks, and special forces intel work, all below the boot on the ground threshold.
And don't forget, Latin America does not want another US intervention. Not Brazil, not Colombia, not Mexico.
Which means Washington can escalate all if it keeps the region neutral, not openly hostile.
And this is where it gets real. Venezuela is a place where Moscow and Beijing can push the US cheaply.
If Washington escalates, expect Russian cyber interference, Chinese economic bailouts, intelligence support for Maduro, armed transfers. Venezuela becomes a proxy playground, not a local crisis.
Now, let's ask some questions. I'll ask you the first question. Is the escalation even strategically sound, or is Washington falling into the old trap of overreach in Latin America?
Well, I do personally believe that it could be strategically sound, not necessarily is strategically sound, but it could be, which means that if it is to protect American interests against Russian and Chinese ones, which is totally fair, especially in a region, Latin America, which is closer to the US than to Russia and China, it's of course strategically sound. However, the US has to pay close attention not to fall again, as we are saying in the question, to the old trap of overreaching Latin America, which means to interfere with Latin American interests, citizens, democratic institutions, if we can call Latin American institutions democratic. But if done in the correct way, extremely focusing on targeting narcos and the cartels in general, yeah, it could be strategically sound, I think. But what about you now? Let's flip the script. Is doing nothing worse, like letting Russia and China entrench themselves permanently?
Well, that's an interesting question. I do believe that Russia and China do have some interesting assets in Venezuela. It's almost like a hotspot for them. They're obviously deep down, this is my opinion, but I believe it's true. They share some information, some intel, and there is definitely awareness by Beijing and by Moscow with the interventions of the US in that area of Latin America. Now, is doing nothing worse? Probably, yeah, I would agree. I like this strong geopolitical stance that Trump has in South America. It would be comparable to what Putin is doing with Ukraine, meaning they're doing some border control, it's called, with the neighboring countries. Now, what I don't agree is the violence. So when they're actually invading, for example, the US with Venezuela or Russia with Ukraine using violence, I don't agree with that. But forcing your neighbors to, let's say, abide to your own strategy and policy, that is realpolitik. And that's what we do here in Gem Politics. We talk about actual strategy. But with that said, is the US, in your opinion, of course, Ale, overestimating its leverage or underestimating the resilience of the authoritarian regimes when they have external backing?
As I honestly see it, and in general I see the foreign policy of Trump in that way more or less, Trump uses always an iron fist policy, also always considering the military power of the United States, and in that case he thinks, okay, if they do something we don't like, we're going to annihilate them. But in geopolitical or strictly political terms, I think that the US, yes, are overestimating what they can do in Latin America. Not because they're not powerful, not because they're not influential, but simply because authoritarian regimes in Latin America have been always very harsh to eradicate, and Venezuela is going to be the same. Maduro is there for many years. Before there was Chavez, something similar happened as well in Argentina or in Colombia and other countries. Latin America is a harsh continent to intervene as an external power. And so let me conclude the episode by asking you another question. At what point does a stabilization mission become outright regime change?
Well, let's say when the logic is messy, I think the logic of intervening in Venezuela indirectly would be clearer, but what they're doing now, it's like putting a foot in two shoes, which is military intervention and economic intervention. I'm not understanding what they're trying to do, but maybe that's the purpose. Then when the risks are massive, of course, I don't have to say it, but because it's obvious, but a full-on invasion of Venezuela would be very difficult. Not so much with the main military, which would be annihilated in, I don't know, like a couple of weeks or whatever. But then it turns into guerrilla warfare, and we know how that ended up in Vietnam. And lastly, when the outcomes are unclear, what's the stated objective? And the real question is, what are the underlying objectives of this potential invasion? Is it to control Maduro? Is it to bring democracy? I don't think so, but yeah. To bring democracy, or is it also to reduce the influence of China and Russia?
Which is exactly why this is the moment to think critically before headlines go crazy. So, where does this leave us? The rumors of US escalation in Venezuela aren't random. They are tied to oil, migration, rival powers, and a regime that survived every external pressure thrown at it.
But that's exactly why it's dangerous. Pushing harder could trigger a proxy clash, destabilize the region, or just repeat every historical mistake Washington already made in Latin America.
And doing nothing isn't great either. It lets Russia and China lock in a strategic foothold right in the US backyard.
Which means this isn't a simple yes or no intervention question. It's a test of whether the US can handle a complex crisis without blowing it up even more.
Thanks for rocking with us. Subscribe, follow, stay connected. YouTube, Spotify, X, whether you listen or watch.
Catch you next episode.
Stay informed, stay engaged.
Peace till next time.